Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then, the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Chiseled Caleb, and today we will be starting with the happy stories, including an amputee who went skydiving, whose journey turned out just right for him, despite some major mishaps. Then we're going to go into the controversial stories of the week after that, in which a real-life Breaking Bad scenario occurs. The brother of a DEA agent actually attempted to sell meth. And after that, we're going to go into my dark stories of the week, which are actually pretty humble this time. The prominent one featured in that segment is going to be about a man who got fined for going around in a cemetery and going, "Ooh, spooky ghost," trying to scare people. And then we'll wrap up with my top 10 weirdest people in history, which will be swells. And we're going to get started with this one in Vermont, where a farmer returns a prosthetic leg to a skydiver who lost it during his skydiving jump. The story began last Saturday when a double amputee went for a jump at Vermont Skydiving Adventures in West Addison. He lost one of his prosthetic legs after jumping from the plane and said, quote, "I think my adrenaline was so high and I was just so excited I didn't even realize I had lost it." Thankfully, the man was actually harnessed to an instructor and therefore he landed safely. In an effort to recover his lost leg, he posted on social media that he lost it during the jump and that if any local farmers could keep an eye open, that would be fantastic. And in fact, one farmer saw the post before finding the prosthetic last Sunday in his soybean field. The leg actually was slightly damaged, but relatively usable. The farmer said, quote, "You've always got to keep an eye out. It was like finding a needle in a haystack." He also said he was grateful and surprised that he found the leg without running it over with a machine during the fall harvest, saying, quote, "God forbid the combine sucked it up, it would have destroyed it." The man who lost his leg said that it turned into a positive experience. Quote, "We kind of take for granted sometimes how many truly good people are still in this world." So that's my first nice heartwarming story for you. It's time to move on to our next one. It's not so much heartwarming as it is cute. Over 100 German shoes went missing, and it turns out that the thief was unmasked to be a fox. He was caught last week and is accused of having stolen over 100 shoes in Germany's capital city of Berlin. Apparently in Berlin, it's common practice to leave their footwear outside of their houses, and as a result, many of these shoes went missing. Authorities at first believed it to be people who were stealing these shoes, but it was quickly discovered that a fox was stealing them instead after a young man took a picture of the animal stealing a shoe and posted it on Facebook. He then posted the picture on Germany's community notice sharing platform board, where the news quickly spread, making this fox somewhat of a celebrity in this big town. It's pretty funny. If you want to Google the picture, it's just a cute little fox stealing a blue flip-flop. Quite adorable. Later on, they actually found the fox's stash. And apparently he was interested in mostly the brightest shoes he could find. So there is a sneaking suspicion that he has an affinity for fashion, flamboyant fashion. If you look at these photos, all the shoes are brightly colored. It's pretty cute. A fox stealing a rainbow of shoes. The Berlin community has since put out a notice saying which shoes have been found, and as a result, many people are being reunited with their old pairs of footwear. Isn't that adorable? This reminds me of a not-so-adorable story. In Colorado, where I live, there's a mountain right next to Pikes Peak. It's called Crystal Park, and there's a lot of mountain lions on this mountain. Anyway, one of my buddies actually lost his dog up there to a mountain lion, and eventually he tracked down its collar. But when he found it, it was in a small cave, and in that small cave was not a mountain lion, but was a couple dozen other dog collars. So the mountain lion would just find a dog and drag it back to its cave, and therefore collected a treasure trove worth of dog collars. Pretty scary, would make an excellent movie scene. And perhaps even a decent wind chime. If you live in the mountains near ferocious animals, do not buy a small dog. They'll just end up as a snack. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about heartwarming stories. So now we're going to go back to the heartwarming stories with my Florida story of the week. That's my weekly Florida story of the week. Where a man tries to evade arrest by doing gymnastics. This was, of course, caught on film, as all fantastic Florida stories are. This young Orlando man was avoiding police. This was after being charged with battery on law enforcement officers. And he also got the title of resisting arrest after his little cartwheel. According to police records, the police got him on the ground only for him to break free. As the man tried to escape, he executed a nice cartwheel into a tight space to avoid the cops' pursuit. However, the cartwheel did not deter them long, and eventually they nabbed him quite quickly and subdued him. Now, this article also mentions that the man is a 40-year-old, and from the video itself, it's well aware that he weighs as much as me, around like 250, so it's pretty impressive that he did a cartwheel in his evasion maneuvers. However, it's also not surprising that he ended up getting caught and is now being charged with resisting arrest as a result. And upon watching the video, you will realize that this man also attempted to do a handstand. It doesn't go so well. He falls over pretty quickly and looks like he injures himself. It's become quite apparent that he was likely under the influence, of drugs. And it actually ended up taking 2 different officers to detain him completely. And even then, he attempted to escape, but it did not go well. He got, not beat up, but he got roughly detained. I recommend that you go check this video out online. It's pretty funny. He'll probably get off pretty lightly. Now, if you can't tell, I'm actually pretty impressed by this fella. I mean, it's not an Escape from Alcatraz level of impressive, but it's got some imagination to it. It's not my go-to escape. This brings to mind a video from a few years ago. I think it was 2018, where a California man, he was caught breakdancing on the security camera during his looting of the facility. It's pretty fun to watch. The guy breaks in, steals a bunch of stuff, and then right in front of the security camera busts a couple of moves, which eventually led police to track him down and return the stolen goods. So take notes, people. Don't avoid police by breakdancing or doing gymnastics. It just doesn't end well. Alright, finally, the story we've all been waiting for. 2 men rob a U.S. convenience store wearing watermelon rind as disguises. So they wore watermelons on their heads with little slits for eyes. It's pretty funny looking. This story surfaced in Virginia after local police uploaded a picture of the heist to social media in order to aid their search for the 2 men accused of robbing the convenience store. This took place last month, May 6th, and apparently nobody has any leads on this story. In fact, the police said, quote, they managed to elude authorities thanks to their brilliant disguises. So even the police recommend wearing watermelons on your head in order to get away with robbing a place. Perhaps this is all a ruse. Perhaps this is all a social media stunt by the police to get more people who rob liquor stores to wear watermelons on their heads, because I can't imagine it would be an efficient way to do such an activity. I don't know the statistics, but I'm willing to bet that the more likely you are to wear a watermelon on your head, the more likely you are to get caught after robbing a liquor store. I'll have to do a study on that and let you guys know how it turns out. Now, it wasn't until about a month and a half later, last Sunday, when authorities eventually arrested a 20-year-old in connection with the, quote, melon drama. Oh, that's clever. Good job, New York News. I wonder if Robbie Canton gave them that joke. The young man brought into custody was booked with 3 different charges: misdemeanor larceny of alcohol, misdemeanor possession of alcohol by an underage person, and felony prohibition of wearing a mask/face covering in public. Now that last one, I don't think should be applied to any modern robbery. Wearing a mask/face covering in public, considering the fact that it is now mandatory for you to wear a mask/face covering in public. So I think they should strike that one from the record and let the man go on that one accusation. Also, this man is quite brave. He didn't give up his partner in crime. The police are still on the lookout for the second person. Eventually, the police questioned a witness at the scene, and the customer said, quote, "Their disguises fell in the thin line between stupid and clever." She goes on to say, quote, "I think it's ridiculous, innovative but ridiculous. The amount of work that you have to do to actually hollow out a watermelon to stick it on your head, I think, is kind of crazy." Now, I think it should be taken into account that the kids were stealing alcohol. So I don't want to jump to any conclusions and say how this started, but my guess is that it started with them carving out a nice watermelon dinner over some fresh brandy. They ran out of brandy, and they said, "Oh my gosh, we need some more, but we don't have any money and we're underage. What do we do? Well, we have these empty watermelons. Why don't we put these on our heads and go heisting our local liquor store?" That's how I would assume this story began. It began with alcohol, and it ends with alcohol. And will most likely end with 2 people in prison, but if it doesn't, at least one of them is in prison. Anyway, it's time to move on. It looks like we have time for one more story before the break. I'm going to go with the U.S. Space Force hiring a horse to walk on beaches. Now, I believe that this story began the same way all governmental spending projects began. The boss goes up to his little accountant there and says, "Hey, Bob, how much money do we have left?" And Bob says, "Enough for a horse." And then the boss says, "Okay, let's hire a horse to walk on the beach endlessly." Now, this is the Space Force, so they have no business buying a horse unless it's going to be a space horse, which I highly doubt they're planning on interspatial cavalry charges. I clearly don't know what I'm talking about, but neither do they, obviously. Anyways, they bought a horse, they named it Ghost. That's all nice and cute. That's why this is in the cute story section. He's a 5-year-old Mustang, and he was added to the, quote, Conservation Military Working Horse Program, which for some reason is part of the Space Force. This story is making less and less sense as we go on. Now, when the manager of the Military Working Horse Program was questioned about this whole situation, he said that the horse is a sort of quadrupedal conservation cop. That's a direct quote. I don't know what it means, and he doesn't know what it means either. Come on, don't even pretend like you know, man. Now, apparently it's their job to traverse hills and beaches while keeping an eye on the many protected species and any intruders that might pose a threat to them. But why is this under Space Force? This doesn't make any sense. In Space Force's defense, one of their fellow workers said, quote, "We enforce fish and game laws, and the horses help us walk off the beaten path to complete our mission. We have even responded to lost hunters and hurt animals." So that's all well and good, but why is this part of the Space Force? This should be part of, like, wildlife preserve. I just find it bizarre. Clearly they don't know what they're doing with our tax dollars. It's kind of a shame they're not sending them to space. I would be all for this if they actually were. Space horses is something I'm not willing to give my tax money to any organization unless they promise me a space horse. I don't know about you guys, but that's my political affiliation. Anyways, that's it for the happy stories. That's what I consider a happy story. Stay tuned to the next segment where we'll talk about a real-life Breaking Bad story.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. I just gave you the happy stories. Now we are going to jump into my Breaking Bad story, in which a Trenton cop's brother admitted to dealing meth. For those who haven't seen Breaking Bad, a man starts cooking meth out of his RV or something, and his brother works for the DEA. So this is kind of a real-life version of that, in which a cop's brother decided to deal meth. According to this report, the man struck a deal with the feds. However, he faces a mandatory 10-year bid and up to life imprisonment, along with $10 million in fines, which he's sentenced to later this year. Part of the deal he made was that he agreed to forfeit $97,000 in cash that was seized from his home last January. Now, the part that makes this like Breaking Bad is that the man's brother is actually in the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which makes this, if not interesting because it's almost real-life based, at least interesting because of the dichotomy. You know, one child grows up to get rid of drugs, the other child grows up to spread drugs on the streets. It should be noted that the man arrested also used to be an officer. It's not stated why he is no longer an officer. Apparently, he became not an officer before this whole meth incident started. Perhaps he just wanted to get farther away from it as he fell down that rabbit hole. The methamphetamine rabbit hole. Anyways, the man's brother was a lead investigator in a 2-year-long $1.3 million drug bust operation in 2016, which targeted 60 different people, some of them high-ranking members of the Bloods, including leader Bobby Williams. So his brother is not only in the DEA, he is actually one of the leaders of the investigation teams. The feds agreed not to initiate any further criminal charges against the arrested man due to the fact that he pled guilty, which means although he might receive punishment as previously stated, he will not be charged against the 1,796 grams of meth, which was seized from his house. Apparently, the feds were already investigating the man's house when the cops raided and found the meth. Along with the large amount of meth, the cops also recovered 52 grams of cocaine, 184 grams of pot prescription pills, several vials of anabolic steroids, and about $97,000 in cash, stored in sealed boxes, wrapped in tin foil, and buried in the man's basement. This is like Breaking Bad. Once they found the man's methamphetamines, he said he was, quote, unaware that it was in his garage. He later on insisted that it was his girlfriend who stashed it there. He only fessed up once the feds walked in the room. Apparently it was a much bigger investigation than anyone was aware of. The man's defense attorney was eventually questioned on how a meth empire could go under the nose of the feds so easily, and she responded, quote, "What kind of meth empire? Leave him alone. You have false information." Alright, I feel like we've squeezed everything we could have out of that one, so now we're going to transition. Dynamite was found in a car over the weekend, but it turned out just to be a beef stick. This occurred in the great state of Kansas, and the situation climaxed as first responders were called to the report of an explosive in a car. The incident occurred around 4:45 p.m. last Wednesday, and the request for a response team resulted in the Greensburg police, firefighters, and deputies all responding at once to what was reported to be a stick of dynamite attached to the dash of a vehicle. The Greensburg Police Department said on Facebook, quote, "Upon units arriving and securing the area, it was discovered that the item in question was a beef stick, still in its wrapper." Of course, there were no explosives and no threats to the public. He goes on to say, quote, "The vehicle owner removed the suspicious beef stick from the dash." Now, there are no further developments in this story, which is kind of sad. I wanted to see how this turned out. I'm somewhat suspicious that it was a prankster who put this all together, but perhaps it was just somebody who confused a beef stick for a stick of dynamite. I'm sure it could happen. Look, I'll be honest, I'm just suspicious because this happened in Kansas and not Florida. Now we're going to transition into a Lithuanian man who was found living in an English forest for 5 years after he went missing. It is reported that he was last seen at work in 2015. Detectives are now investigating whether or not he fled an exploitative situation, which would be like blackmail or getting involved with the mob, something like that. Anyway, it said that he was last seen leaving his work at a fruit and vegetable supplier in the town of, this is going to be my mispronunciation of the week, Chatteris, Cambridgeshire of Castleberry. That's a brilliant name. Anyways, police believe that the 35-year-old gathered with other men of his native Lithuania after work that night and was never seen again. A few weeks after the man's disappearance, police launched a murder investigation. Quote, "There were genuine concerns on whether or not he came to harm that evening. He did not return to work on Monday, 28th September 2015 as expected, but now we believe he made the decision to run away, as he had been a victim of crime, having previously been subject to exploitation. After several years, they stopped looking for the man, presuming he was dead. However, a recent trip led them to search the wooded area in a nearby town, where, quote, the man was eventually found living in undergrowth, very well concealed after having deliberately hidden and having not spoken with anyone for some time. We made the decision not to publicly announce we had found the man alive until now in order to protect him and put safeguarding measures in place. He is safe, and we are working very closely with him to ensure he remains safe, but also to ensure he gets the support he needs after having lived through extremely difficult circumstances during the last 5 or more years." This article concludes with the Cambridgeshire Police urging people to visit their website in order to learn about the signs of exploitation and modern-day slavery, so they can report it and help those who may be experiencing it. Alright, time for a nice little cute story. A young dog is being called the unicorn puppy because it has an extra tail on its forehead. The puppy's name is Norwal, and he was actually found abandoned. However, after somebody found him, he found online fame. Such a bad line. Due to the fact that he looks like a unicorn. Not really, it's kind of a dopey looking. He has a tail just swooping down in the middle of his forehead. It's pretty cute, but it doesn't make him look like a unicorn. I'm not going to lie to you folks. You can go online and look it up. It is adorable in that ugly sort of way that some dogs are both hideous and cute. Apparently, a Missouri rescue group found the dog when he was only 10 weeks old. The group specializes in dogs with special needs, injuries, or abuse issues, and as a result, took him in forthwith. The rescue group wrote on Facebook, Norwal is super excited for being the poster child for, quote, special is awesome. The clinic's veterinarian said that the dog is a, quote, Dachshund mix, and the tail is likely a congenital defect. He goes on to say, quote, those usually manifest in dogs as cleft palates or extra toes, and the causes can range from environmental factors to toxins, which the puppy's mothers may have been exposed to. He finishes his statement by saying, quote, he could visit hospitals, schools, and nursing homes, showing others that being different is more than okay. It's great, in fact. Very inspirational, this puppy with a tail on its forehead. When asked if the tail could lead to any health problems, the clinic responded that the only problem is that we wish it wagged. The tail is not actually connected to any muscles or anything, it's just dangling off his forehead. It should be noted that he is not available for adoption just yet. The clinic wrote, quote, "We want him to grow up a bit more and truly make sure the tail doesn't become a bother or a problem." And finally, you can go online and look up videos of this child dog being playful and happy again, which is really nice to see. He's chewing up all sorts of things that squeak, pretending to be alive, so it's good to see that he kept his vicious animal instincts intact. And that's it for my controversial stories of the week. Stay tuned to the next segment where I'll give you my dark stories, including a man who got fined for pretending to be a ghost in a cemetery.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. Time to go into my dark stories of the week. A man is fined for pretending to be a ghost in a Portsmouth cemetery. So this occurred in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where a young man, the age of 24, was spotted in the cemetery trying to scare people dressed as a ghost. He was, quote, flapping his arms, throwing himself backwards, and making ghost noises. That's in a police report. Isn't that beautiful? Now, the sad part of this is that he was reported by mourners. So people went there to mourn the death of their family, and they saw a ghost. That's kind of sad. After further investigations, the court had determined that the young man had been out drinking with his friends. And they went to the cemetery to play football. That's always my go-to place for playing football, is the cemetery. So many memories. And the policeman who arrested this young 24-year-old said, quote, "The witnesses report the group engaging in rowdy behavior and one of them throwing their arms in the air saying, 'Woo!' As punishment, the young man was fined 35 euros. I don't know why it's in euros. He was fined 35 euros in order to pay 20 extra euros of victim surcharge and another 20 in costs deterred. So he's making out with about 75 euros worth of damage. And on top of that, he had an extra 3 months added to his conditional charge for previous harassment, which he was found to be in breach of according to the prosecution. And if he does anything like this again, that's a breach in his suspended sentence. He will face 12 weeks in prison. And the funny thing is, he got in trouble for pretending to be a ghost, but he was also charged with causing criminal damage to a gravestone. So he vandalized somebody's final place of rest. But that accusation was actually dismissed because the witnesses failed to turn up at court. So these rapscallions probably won't be going back to the graveyard to play football anytime soon. But speaking of moving on, let's move on to the next one. A Satanic Temple offering academic scholarships to high school grads. Now, this Satanic Temple isn't just offering one, it's offering 2 academic scholarships. So, any students who demonstrate satanic values may apply for, quote, Devil's Advocate Scholarships Awards. The first of these is, what initiatives have you undertaken that are consistent with the Satanic Temple's tenets and mission? The second one is, please discuss and describe in detail any one of the teachers who crushed your spirit, undermined your self-confidence, and made you hate every minute you were forced to be in school. So they're really appealing to the masses here, right? I mean, that second one could be applied to about 70% of all graduating high schoolers. Why didn't you like high school? Tell the Satanic Church. They go on to say that these prompts can be answered in whatever way the high schoolers want, including essay, poems, film, art projects, and other creative mediums. And the Satanic Temple co-founder, Malcolm Jerry, he explained in his prepared statement, quote, the pursuit of knowledge and the protection of bodily autonomy constitute an essential component of the Satanic Church's mission. The compulsory school system, in opposition to our beliefs, violates students' fundamental civil rights and ingrains obedience to the unearned authority. Satanists believe in individual rights. What do you think of that? Defenders of schools often celebrate the rare teacher who is supportive. This is dishonest because inspirational teachers are anomalies. Much more common are the teachers who abusively wield their power and are outright cruel. Often these teachers leave lifelong psychological scars. Everyone has horror stories about their teachers, but this is considered unremarkable and taken for granted. The Satanic Temple wants to draw attention to this and other problems with schooling. The Satanic Temple opposition to tyrannical constructs is core and fundamental. And that concludes the brilliant statement of the Satanic Church. I think a lot is revealed in that statement, including the fact that these Satanists they really just had a bad school experience. That's why they all turned out so grumpy. I think it's funny that these Satanic church-going people they're upset about teachers not being supportive. It's just all so goofy. They went on to say that a student does not need to be a member of the church in order to apply for this scholarship. Applicants will only be judged on how their submission best exemplifies the mission. So I applied for this scholarship. I was inspired by this the Satanic Temple, their about page. Go to the satanictemple.com. That's where you can apply. And on their website it says, quote, the mission of the Satanic Temple is to encourage benevolence and empathy. They also advocate for common sense, they oppose injustice, and believe that they should undertake noble pursuits. Now, I recommend you go and do some research on the Satanic Temple, because it's just hilarious. They're all about rights and fighting injustice. It's very funny. All these tenets are so agreeable, but then it says the Satanic Temple right above it all, so that part kind of throws you off. But, you know, if you're willing to donate, you can get a personalized membership card, so that's fun. They also sell face masks and commemorative coins. That is brilliant. So I think this is really just a goofy kind of group. I don't think this is any more different than like a Comic-Con kind of thing. Just a group of weirdos with some fun beliefs that are really not trying to do anything serious. They're just trying to have fun and spread their message while they can. But apparently you can also get a scholarship from them now. So, you know, take advantage of that, if you will. Take advantage of the Satanic Temple. You don't need to be a member in order to win the scholarship. So if you're against Satan, why not apply for the scholarship? You win the scholarship and you're taking their money. using it to promote your own values. What do you think of that? Alright, so our next story is about a floating cinema. In order to encourage social distancing, set sail in Houston. That's a little pun. It sets sail. It's really just floating on water. But basically the idea is, if you feel you've been missing out by not being able to go to the movie theater during this pandemic, you can go to this water theater, and at this water theater you can rent your own little mini boat, and you can row it up and watch a movie floated onto the big screen. So basically it's the Aqua equivalent of drive-in movie theaters, which have also been popping up since the pandemic started. And now they're bringing that same kind of idea to the water. The floating cinemas will include 12 to 24 mini boats, each carrying up to 8 people. This will include a unique socially distanced entertainment experience that can't be found anywhere else, according to this company. So I think this is pretty clever, because what they've done is they've basically done a drive-in movie service, but now you're renting the boats. So imagine a drive-in movie theater business where you have to pay for your car as well. You don't just pay for the ticket. So it's a pretty clever way to make money off of the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people. No, I'm kidding. They're entertaining us, folks. They're finding ways around the problems COVID has given us. Now, their excuse is that customers will be required to rent at least one mini boat, quote, to ensure that groups will be seated with friends and family only, and to allow for social distancing on and between boats. Moviegoers, therefore, will be able to watch movies in the open air, snack on free popcorn, and other refreshments available to purchase. So this is another great development in the market as a result of this pandemic, because the question is this thing going to last beyond the pandemic? I don't see it lasting during the pandemic, much less afterwards. It'll probably be popular for a week or two, but it'll quickly die out. Oh well, it was a nice try. I'd love to go try it. The company is boasting that they'll be screening a mix of new releases and classic films. The location of the theater has not been announced yet. Nevertheless, you can pre-order tickets for the Floating Cinema Experience, which starts on September 23rd in Austin, Texas. Alright, now we're gonna end our news segments with a sad story about a New Zealand pond losing their beloved eel, McPherson, that's the name of the eel, during a massive storm. So this eel has been famous in New Zealand for almost 35 years. I didn't know eels lived that long. Anyway, it lived in a backyard pool and ended up disappearing in a once-in-a-500-year flood, which tore through New Zealand and took their beloved eel away from them. Now, thankfully, the place this pond was located is only about 50 meters from the beach in New Zealand, and so it's most likely that this eel did not die during the storm, but rather just ended up in the ocean. Hopefully it has its means intact to survive. The eel's owner's granddaughter said, quote, "It would have had just to go down the driveway and across the road at high tide during a flood. It wouldn't really have even needed to worry about the beach." So she speculates that it made it to the beach, which is nice. And then this young lady had a talk with her grandfather, the man who owned the fish, and said that he felt a bit gutted by it. But she sat him down and had a talk with him and said, quote, "But once we had a chat about it, we realized the timing of it would be right for it naturally to spawn." So they expect it not only to have made it to the ocean, but also to breed successfully. Apparently it's the right time in New Zealand for such an event to occur. So the reason this eel became famous in the first place is because way back in 1995, the eel was popularized because it was because the pond it was held in was public and many children came by and played with it, and it kind of gave away the stigma that eels were gross. Kind of made them a cute creature. It actually held some significance in that New Zealand town. And to wrap up this story, we're going to end with another quote. The young lady said, "They don't all have that characteristic where they're so tame and their demeanor is so peaceful that they don't mind people and can handle a bit of a pat. It was a very special creature and an excellent ambassador for its species. It wasn't just any eel." And that's it for the Dark Stories of the Week. Stay tuned to the next segment, and I will give you my top 10 weirdest people throughout history.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. Top 10 weirdest people throughout history. Number 10, Diogenes. Not much is known about this man. Of course, he's the great Greek philosopher. But the thing is, he wasn't all that great, actually. When he was a boy, he was exiled from his homeland and Greek colony of Sinope for adulterating the gold and silver content of the coins he used to purchase items, as well as those he created and minted himself. So he moved to Corinth, where he became a homeless beggar. He then voluntarily threw away all of his possessions except for some rags to his hide and a wooden bowl for food and drink. It is then that it is said he became the first-class clown. He would sit in at Plato's classes, eating loudly, sometimes to purposely disrupt the lessons. It is also said that he argued loudly with Plato of philosophy during Plato's lectures, and he would also periodically pleasure himself during the sermons. That's filthy. Beyond that, he relieved himself whenever he felt like it, one time on Plato's stool in his own academy. Despite this, there are many stories of his quick wit and penetrating insight that left others, especially Plato, looking foolish. It is said that when Alexander the Great visited him while he was sunning himself, while naked on top of a barrel in which he lived, Diogenes asked the most powerful man in the world if he could do anything to help him. And Diogenes responded, "You could move out of my light." So he yelled at Alexander the Great for getting in the way of his tan. Pretty odd fella. Number 9. A French peasant boy known as Terraria, who was born in France around 1772. And he is said to have been the hungriest man who ever lived. At age 17, the gluttonous yet emaciated Terraria snuck into village barns to eat the livestock's feed. He had an unusually large mouth, was said to have always been sweating, and emitted a putrid stench. As a result, Terraria's parents kicked him out, and so he found himself in the city of Paris, where he made a career out of eating strange things, which would gather crowds. He would eat all kinds of unpalatable objects, including live animals and even large stones. Then the French Revolution began, and people were really no longer interested in freak shows, so Terraria became a soldier. It was then that General Alexandre Beauharnais approached Terraria about being a spy. He knew Terraria's reputation and expected that he could deliver military secrets with his stomach as his courier. So what happened was Terraria agreed and ingested a wooden box containing a note from an imprisoned French colonel. However, within 30 hours of crossing Prussian lines, he was captured and was savagely beaten. He died around the age of 27 when his autopsy revealed obliterated intestines. There's a lot of other really gross stuff about that, but I'm not going to go into it. Number 8. Lord Byron, who we're not going to focus on too much because we focused on him enough on this show already. He was born in 1788 to immense amounts of wealth, and he is known for his poetry in his early life. More than that, he would use it to publicly insult the likes of his fellow poets, including the great Walt Whitman, who he would relentlessly mock as humorless drips who only got published because they paid somebody off. When he attended the University of Cambridge, authorities told him that he could not take his dog with him, so he adopted a pet bear because there were no laws that said he couldn't adopt a pet bear. After he left college, he wrote several books before having an affair with his long-lost sister, which led to a divorce with his already upset wife. Eventually, he got bored writing books and decided to rewrite the Bible with stories that he considered more interesting. Eventually, he sold his entire estate and gave the money away in Greece, which was fighting for independence at the time. And very soon after, he died of a sudden illness at the age of 36. A bizarre individual. Number 7. Hetty Greene, who was a lady who lived around the Civil War era, the United States Civil War era, that is. She was born to a very rich family in 1837, and she became even more rich when she married a millionaire named Edward Henry Greene. She would then divorce him, take half his money, and he would die a year later after going bankrupt. But Miss Hetty lived on in many weird ways. It is said that she amassed a fortune in equity and commodities trading, which may have topped over $1 billion, which is equal to $27 billion today. And despite that wealth, it is said that she was miserable and was unwilling to spend any of that money. She never bought an office, and she conducted all of her business on the floor of her bank while surrounded by paperwork. During her workday, she would go out for walks occasionally, where she would get paranoid. She would try to shake imaginary stalkers, earning her the name the Witch of Wall Street. A few years into her billionairehood, and her child Ned broke his leg, and this is where her cheap nature had its downfall. She tried to set the broken leg herself, and of course that did not work, so she disguised herself and her son as paupers and tried to get in at the free clinic. Of course, they got kicked out, and she finally took him in and paid for his medical care when Ned's leg became infected and had to be amputated, making her one weird goof. Number 6, Henry Cyril Paget, who lived from 1875 to 1905. All these people have very short lives. However, at age 27, he inherited the title of the 5th Marquis of Anglesey, which means he earned a 30,000-acre estate and a yearly stipend that was worth about $14 million today. As a result, he went out to search for his wildest dreams. He would buy dresses with encrusted diamonds and sapphires. Some people liken him to a, quote, sort of apparition, a tall, elegant, and bejeweled creature. His pole carts even had gems on them, and he would even carry around a dyed pink poodle. And when he married his cousin, he treated her the same way, buying her expensive gems, which he requested that she model for him while nude. He then built his own personal theater where he hired actors to do Shakespeare for him at 10 times the going rate for actors at the time. The only catch was he himself would have to be the protagonist. And as a result of all this lavishness, just 2 years after inheriting the large estate, he went broke. In fact, he got $700,000 in unpaid debts, and he died 1 year later of tuberculosis. Alright, number 5. Karl Tanzler, who was an Austrian-born physician who lived during the 20th century until he died in 1931. One day he fell in love with one of his patients who had tuberculosis, which at the time was terminal. And at the time, tuberculosis was overruling his life. Tanzler committed himself to caring for the patient he fell in love with and made every attempt to save her life while also showing her many affectionate gifts and possessions in order to prove his love. However, she died a few months later, which gave Tanzler a deep heartbreak. So he bought a giant mausoleum for her to be buried in, and this is where it gets a bit weird, as he was the only one with the key to the mausoleum, and so he would visit the lady's body every night for 2 years until he evidently decided that he wanted closure. So in 1933, he stole the decaying body from its tomb and kept it in his home with him. Of course, after being dead for 2 years, the body was heavily decomposed, so he used plaster and glass eyes to maintain the integrity of the woman's face, and even stabilized the skeletal frame by using coat hangers and wires. This went on until the body was 7 years dead. The woman's sister eventually confronted Tanzler, where she made the grisly discovery of her sister's remains. And Tanzler was subsequently arrested for grave robbing. But since the statute of limitations had expired since it had been 7 years, he avoided any jail time. Number 4. Gloria Ramirez. This will be a pretty quick one. When she was 31 years old, she was said to have late stages of cervical cancer, which caused her sudden deterioration. Doctors quickly got to work on trying to save her, but nothing seemed to be working. Nurses removed Ramirez's shirt and saw a mysterious oily sheen on her skin and her mouth, which was emitting a fruity, garlicky smell. A few weeks later, after trying to treat her, one nurse suddenly went numb and eventually even became paralyzed. And one by one, after another, the nurses in the room started to feel faint. Each of the nurses developed breathing problems, and several developed paralysis. Nobody at the time knew why, and it became even more mysterious when Miss Ramirez died. A special team came to examine Ramirez's body while wearing hazmat suits to protect themselves from whatever had taken down the nurses, which gave Ramirez the nickname Toxic Lady. They concluded that Ramirez died of heart failure due to kidney failure brought on by late-stage cancer. However, the autopsies never presented definitive reasons for Ramirez's strange ailments and why several of the hospital staffers fell mysteriously ill. Number 3, this is a dark one. Anneliese Michael. She was born in the 1960s in Bavaria, West Germany, and she was a deeply religious and devout Catholic who developed epilepsy. She later began to see and hear the devil and even hear demons telling her that she was damned and would rot in hell. She was convinced that she was possessed by demons and sought out for the help of priests. After a long search, priest Ernest Alst was the first to believe her story and got a local bishop to consent to exorcisms. 67 different exorcisms were experimented on Miss Michael, but none of them worked. Michael herself claimed that she was possessed by Lucifer, Cain, Judas Iscariot, Adolf Hitler, and Nero. So pretty much all the worst people from history, if you're a Christian. It is said that she prayed so much on her knees that her knee bones actually broke, which is odd because there aren't knee bones, I don't think. Nevertheless, she slowly stopped eating and eventually died in 1976. Her parents and her priests were charged with negligent homicide for her death. They were all found guilty and escaped prison time due to the circumstances. Number 2, Margaret Lavatt. You guys have probably heard of this lady. She is the one who had a relationship with a dolphin during a NASA-founded experiment. So basically somebody built a dolphin enclosure, and Miss Margaret found her way to the facility where she taught the dolphins in daily lessons, with the goal to help them create human-like sounds so they could talk. She became so obsessed with the idea that she began living in the lab, and she even formed a special relationship with one of the dolphins, Peter. And it said that Peter had the same affections for her. And this is where it gets explicit, folks. So if you're not into that, maybe skip ahead a few minutes. The dolphin was obsessed with the woman and would express sexual urges by rubbing himself on her. Eventually, the woman responded by pleasuring the dolphin's urges, so she would not have to share him with the female dolphins. She said, quote, "It wasn't sexual on my part, sensuous perhaps. It seemed to me that it made the bond closer, not because of the sexual activity, but because of the lack of having to keep breaking. And that's really all it was. I was there to get to know Peter. That was part of Peter." That's so sad, but not even as sad as this part. Eventually, Peter was transferred to a lab in Miami, and the dolphin was so heartbroken that he actually committed suicide in his tank. Basically, he just never rose to the surface for oxygen, which is what ended this tragic love story. Number 1, Sonny Bean. This guy's number 1 because you probably haven't heard of him. He was a Scottish man whose weirdness has reached the level of folklore. Despite this, he really did exist. It's most likely that he lived in the 15th or 16th century in Scotland, where he and a female companion hid out in a cave for 25 years due to their rampant cannibalism. They had a couple of kids who had a couple of kids with each other. Eventually, the Bean clan had 48 members, all of which came from Mr. and Mrs. Bean, and are expected to have eaten 1,000 people, who they would catch and then bring back to their secluded cave to be shared amongst the family. Eventually, however, they discovered one man who they really wanted to eat. However, when upon attacking him, he attacked back and his highly skilled swordsmanship fought them off. In fact, it became a chase. The swordsmen got together with some townsfolk and began chasing the Bean family down. The search party found the cave, and all of the family were captured and sent to jail. And they were eventually executed for their horrific crimes. And thus ends the story of Sonny Bean, as well as the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. So I will thank you for listening and ask you to subscribe, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, leave a comment, as well as a review. It helps us out a lot. Thank you. Have a good night.